Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these matters with you. I think it's important for academics not to stay in their ivory towers, although that's more comfortable. We'll get some feedback from the real world, and I think that could be useful. There is a stream of initiatives and opinions. So perhaps you need to be a full-time academic to be able to sort of grasp it all, and perhaps it's too much to say that I really have grasped it all, but at least I've got a better overview than most people can do in their normal work days. First of all, what we are talking about, it's important to define, as always, and we're talking about automation. That's obvious. That's not a new thing. That has been going on for a long time, and in particular in shipping, we are concerned about less crew on board, and perhaps no operators, not even ashore. In vehicles, I think the remote control vehicles will come, land vehicles, the remote control land vehicles will come first, but then again, perhaps we will get some vehicles with no operators, and in particular those vehicles sort of hanging on after another vehicle. And this is made possible by decisions by artificial intelligence. And I think it's important to state that we are talking about the problems that are particular to artificial intelligence. And with that, I mean decisions that are not pre-programmed. There's some sort of analysis or creativity by a computer making the decisions. There's a gradual increase, and I mean, I'm sure we all have met, for example, bureaucrats that we do not think are very creative or very analytic. And on the other hand, they can be computers that are not really artificially intelligent, but they are well programmed for their field of work. We don't need to define that very precisely for our purposes. When it comes to transport, land transport is important, and there are many experiments for land transport. And in Oslo, we have tried some buses, and well, I have tried some of them, and in the end, I just went off and walked because that was a little bit faster. But of course, things will improve, and the interesting thing here is that we're all part of this experiment, and people are interested to show their achievements, even before perhaps they are ready for the general public. In sea transport, I think this will be a reality much before land transport. And that's because the long sea legs with not very dense traffic, and where there's much to save by slow-moving vessels because of the energy consumption. And while the crew would not enjoy very much if the sea legs were too slow. So by automating, one could save crew, but one can also save the crew of the boredom at sea. There may be some airplanes in the future. There may be some trains. Trains could be quite easy to automate fully because they're on tracks. I think people will not like to know about it, at least if a plane they are riding on is fully run by artificial intelligence. First of all, there is this question about the general framework. Ships, for example, have liberties under the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, and do autonomous vessels have the right and liberties of ships? Can they sail in innocent passage in the territorial waters of states, for example? Or could they go through narrow channels, which is another right ships have? It seems that most states accept that autonomous ships are also ships, although the UNCLOS, this Law of the Sea Convention, does presuppose that there are crew members on board. This isn't really defined, and I think this question has to be addressed at some stage, because obviously small vessels like drones could not have the same liberties as ships. For example, one would not like to allow them to navigate in a way that could make them useful or for espionage, for example. So I do think we need some regulations here. For road vehicles and aircraft, there are also some international conventions regulating safety features, for example. But the starting point here is that the states have sovereignty to regulate this, to deny landing of an aircraft and to prohibit the movement of autonomous road vehicles. This is different from the law of the sea, where there are some liberties for ships that is not subject to the approval of the coastal states. So in this sense, it's much easier. But as I understand, there is also general agreement that, for example, autonomous road vehicles will not be a violation of the existing safety conventions, within the jurisdiction of one state. So we have this problem then of regulating, in particular, international shipping, but international trade generally. And the International Maritime Organization, which is a FN, United Nations agency, independently created and then later on put into the UN organization. That the IMO has discussed this very much. How could one sort of make a sandbox for ships to develop and test autonomous features? And the starting point is that this would be a violation of international safety conventions, which at least for international trade or ships intended for international traffic would apply also in domestic waters. There is a resolution allowing states to establish trial areas or accept ships with autonomous features or all autonomous ships. So as long as you are in your internal or domestic waters, that will work fine. But obviously, there could be a problem if you wish to try it out in international trade. There is a project now that's not confidential, that perhaps one should try an autonomous route between Norway and the Netherlands. For many reasons, that would perhaps work very well. But while the IMO resolution allows the ships to sail within the internal waters, so both states, there's no jurisdiction of IMO and no resolution allowing ships to sail without complying with the international safety conventions at the high seas between those two states. So that would indeed create a problem. I think perhaps the IMO would try to agree on some compromise there. I will not be the person who would say that this would not be legally possible. Perhaps it would, though. And then we have this problem, which is a lawyer's problem, really, of all the regulations that presuppose that there are crew on board vessels and crew on board road traffic vehicles. And in IMO, there has been a big scoping exercise. They've been looking through all the regulations, and there are many of them, and they try then to see whether the need to change the text. It's not very exciting if one first agrees that the text should be made so that it allows autonomous vessels. And I think there is some resistance in some contexts, but that's mostly of a political nature, or perhaps because they feel it's too soon or too scary. But the principle is that this is just a drafting exercise. I should make an example who shows how practical this is. And just as on land, we have traffic rules on the sea. So there are rules saying that a ship meeting another ship should yield if the other ship is on its starboard side, for example. Starboard is, of course, the right-hand side. And a rule like that could be complied with by an autonomous vessel. No problem. There are some angles that are critical. You have to define whether a ship is catching up with another ship or actually coming from the side of the other ship, etc., etc. But that a computer could work out that easily. But then there are rules like the general rule that one should make a turn in ample time if one is in a position to yield, so the other ship can see what's going on. And it's difficult to say in advance, in particular, whether the ship will actually do that, because we don't really know what ample time means in different contexts. One approach then would be to define that, but then we lose something, because there's a reason why these legal rules are made in this way. This is because one wishes to maintain flexibility, one wishes to allow for a multiple of considerations. So what should one do? Well, we work with this in a project between the University of Oslo and the Norske Veritas, the Norwegian class. And one of the things we work with is to actually figure out what shipmasters do. And we analyze the AIS data from very many ships in very many areas. And then we can see how they actually sail when they approach another ship. And then we perhaps can generate some sort of a better understanding of how ships actually sail. This is important, of course, for an autonomous vessel to see how other ships can be expected to sail. A master would know, but a computer would not. And on the other hand, it's important for other ships to see how the autonomous ships can be expected to sail. This is a long way forward, but I think this is necessary to cope with these sort of discretionary rules that are not very precise. So to keep on talking about vessels, this is interesting. I will revert to road vehicles later on, but this is interesting because the basis for liability at sea generally is negligence liability. You will not be liable unless you have acted negligently without sufficient care. And then, of course, we would ask, can an autonomous vessel be negligent? I mean, there are no persons on board. There's just this machine. And I think perhaps it's possible to say that, well, if the computer does not recognize a dangerous situation and do the necessary maneuvers, then if the vessel is negligent, then the programmer is. And perhaps the ship owner should be vicariously liable for the negligence act of the programmer. But as a concept, it's very difficult to say that an autonomous vessel as such can be negligent, because it has no mind of its own. And then some people say, well, then we need to make the liability strict. And this is one solution. So then we say that we just change the liability rules so that there is strict liability without need to prove negligence. If the vessel causes damage, then it should be liable for that damage. But then again, this would be a problem. There is a reason why we have negligence liability. And that reason is that accidents happen. And perhaps one shouldn't be liable all the time. And in collision between two autonomous vessels, strict liability will not give much guidance. Then perhaps one would have to revert to the negligence rule anyway. So I don't think it's very smart just to introduce a rule of strict liability. Technically, one would also have then to distinguish between the situation where damage was caused by the artificial intelligence system and other parts of the vessel's nature. There's no reason to make ships liable just because they are have an artificial intelligence on board. For example, if the problem really was that there is a big ship and was driven towards another ship by unexpected strong winds. And then if one should maintain the negligence thinking, then there are some situations where one would think that it's the result and not the cause of the action that's the important thing. One would say that, well, if that ship's navigated so badly, someone did something negligent on board. So one would turn the perspective. And in the same way, if one has an accident, then someone has to be negligent, and if there is an artificial intelligence-driven ship, then the programmer has to be negligent. But if the negligence causing the accident is in the programming, that will be perhaps at the building stage of the vessel. And that's perhaps 15 years ago. And then the negligence claim under most time-barring rules will be time-barred. So we actually would have a problem here if one should use the negligence rule. And there's also a problem to really figure out what did happen. Some people say that we need some more transparency, so the artificial intelligence system should tell us everything it does. And I'm afraid most of us in that case would not be able to understand it. It will be too complex. So for that reason also, one would not like to have negligence liability. In maritime law, there is a collision convention actually stating very clearly that when two ships collide, the liability should be based on negligence. So what did the EU do about this? Well, they have this one-size-fits-all approach. They actually try to regulate AI across the board, and that's doomed to fail. The European Parliament were first out with a liability proposal, and that was based on a distinction between high-risk systems and ordinary systems. And of course, the heat control in my home, that could be based on artificial intelligence, but it's not a high-risk system. But most transport systems would be high risk in the sense that they could cause severe damage through third parties. But that proposal, I think, is not more on the table. Much has happened since then. The Commission has proposed an AI Act, which is very much an act of which in very general terms states that one has to be careful and which precautions one has to take when one would need a permission. And there is a distinction also here between high risk and ordinary risk AI system. But the liability is not addressed there, and it has been addressed in 3 other instruments. And the first is the motor vehicle liability system, which is very old, and I'm not sure if it really needs revision for artificial intelligence, because 100 years ago, when road traffic started to increase, one introduced strict liability for motor vehicles for any damage it caused. But for a collision between two motor vehicles, it will usually be negligence liability. And then, of course, it could be a problem which vehicles were to blame if they're both run by artificial intelligence. But there is an associated insurance, so it's maybe not that important. And then there is this product liability proposal. That's a revision of the product liability rules. And it does address artificial intelligence in the comments. And the idea here is that rather than base liability on negligence, as my starting point earlier was, one should simply look, is this product safe? And that would be a much better approach. The time limitation will start to run from any accident. One doesn't care who actually did the mistakes, if any. One would just see, is the result satisfactory, seen from the injured person's side? And of course, the answer will usually be no. In the draft, there is a clarification that not only the ship owner or the vehicle owner, but also the producer of the AI system used for that vehicle or for that vessel will be liable. There are some details here. I will not go into them, but they have actually managed to turn around the thinking from negligence to the result. Is the product sufficiently safe? Doesn't give much predictability, but it does give the necessary liability. Not all AI-driven systems are products. They do not necessarily form a part of a thing that is a product. So there is a separate AI liability directive proposal. And the idea here is that rather than introducing strict liability, they will introduce a reversed burden of proof. So if there is a use of artificial intelligence and there is an accident, then it is for the operator of the vehicle or whatever it is to prove that the AI system was safe. That would be very helpful. And there are also some listings of in which respects they're supposed to be safe. And if one thinks about the ships we mentioned, they could be considered products. I think they would. And then they will go under the product liability rules. but also here one would see whether they were safe or not, and one would need some testing. And the project I mentioned that we should see how ships normally sail, that would make it possible to prove that this ship would usually be safe, because one could test it in a number of situations, millions of situations actually, in a computer, and see that normally the AI system would operate in a safe manner. So that accidents sometimes happen should not cause that one should have liability in all cases. There are some other rules that are also important here in road traffic. There are limitations of liability in some contexts, but not liability. It's on the insurance level. But how about the ships? They have a right to limit. I think it would be very appropriate here to ask a computer about this. And I asked these questions: does an autonomous ship have the right to limit liability? And a couple of other questions. And here's the answer I got from the chatbot. And I must say, I was kind of relieved. I still think I'm needed as a lawyer at the university, at least until I retire, because this answer is very inconsistent. It does answer just that an autonomous ship can limit liability just as on any other ship. Well, I don't know the reasons for this answer. That's the problem. There is a distinction, and it gives some reasons for limitation of liability. That is not up to standard. Usually one would say that this is for insurance purposes and not for losses beyond the control of the owner. And then in the third answer, it goes back and it says that, well, it is unexpected behavior of autonomous system that the ship owner should be liable for, in direct contradiction to answer number 2. So this is just an illustration for fun. I just want to say that, well, yes, I think there is a use for human lawyers. Short in the end here, there hasn't really been a problem with insurance, not on land and in marine insurance. The liability insurance is called protection and indemnity, and the protection and indemnity insurance, they are owned by ship owners, and they've been very positive to this development. There is however, a few insurance clauses, in particular the so-called cyber clause, that excludes liability for failure of computers. These were introduced in connection with the turn of the millennium. You may recall that one were very worried about this. But they still hang around, and in particular, they hang around in respect of liability towards passengers on, for example, cruise ships. So that would need to be changed. So I hope this very rapid tour around the problems of liability of transport modes and artificial intelligence has given you some overview. My slides and my presentation will be available afterwards, and I'm more than willing to engage in discussions after the next presentation, and also later on if you like. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Very interesting and insightful, and also reassuring that that we lawyers will still have something to do and be useful, hopefully, for some more years. Thank you, and of course, please, if you have questions for Erik, save them for the Q&A, or post them in the chat. That is also possible. So you don't forget about those tricky questions for Erik. Thank you. And now then, Goran, it's over to you.
Thank you
for your presentation.
Thank you, Erik, for the presentation, and thanks for having me here today. I'm really happy that Erik said that you need to be a full-time academic to grasp it all, because I just feel that there's a massive flow of new regulations coming, and it's really, really hard as an in-house lawyer to understand everything that is proposed and how it will connect. So I was asked to talk a bit about liability for AI and automated transport, and shortly about myself. My name is Goran Widborn. I work as a corporate legal counsel at Sensact. I joined Sensact in January last year, so 2022. I've been in Volvo Cars since May 2010, and I've been working a lot with active safety in Volvo Cars. And before that, I worked, among others, in ABB in the process automation division, and I've been working a lot with software in my previous jobs as well. But this is a completely new area. And Sensact, I just want to give you a short introduction about the company. So Sensact is a wholly owned subsidiary of Volvo Cars. We have around 500 employees, and we have offices in Gothenburg, Lindholmen, and in Shanghai. And Sensact is a software company that is working with advanced driver assistance systems and autonomous drive. The mission of Sensact is to, as we say, it's to move towards zero faster. So 0 deaths, 0 injuries, 0 accidents. That's what we strive for. The culture in Sensact is very much around people, or we call it people at heart culture, and our main values are trust, collaboration, and innovation. So it's a super interesting company, and of course it's super exciting technology. And that's what the legislators believe as well, as we can see with all the new proposals. So I was thinking about talking a little bit about the AI Liability Directive proposal. And since this is still a proposal, and the AI regulation is still a proposal, I think that we are all aware of that we can expect changes. They are both still subject to discussions, and I think I read something last week that there is already some delays expected. So I don't know if my comments or thoughts will be relevant in the end, but I'll talk a bit about it. And my main focus will be on the AI that is that we see will be in the vehicle. As a company, we will of course use AI in other areas as well, but I think that the vehicle is the interesting part here. So this directive is primarily about litigation rules, and as an in-house counsel, you seldom end up, at least not me, you always use a law firm to support in litigation. So I don't have expertise within litigation rules, but of course I can see the proposals that are in the AI directive about disclosure of evidence and burden of proof. And that will of course affect us as well. And one thinking that I have is that the directive as proposed, it's highly dependent on the AI regulation. There are so many references in the directive to the regulation. And of course, one can think about, should the liability aspect be covered by the regulation as well? I'm sure they have been thinking about that and probably are thinking about that the liability perspective should be regulated in the same way as the product liability that Erik talked about in a directive. And of course, there are pros and cons with that. As we know, regulation will have direct effect, and while a directive there will be there's a risk that there will be quite a lot of differences in each member state. So there will remain a lot of subjects that will be subject to national law, with the pros and cons of that. And Erik mentioned that as well. So this is a general application of this AI AI liability directive proposal. So it's like horizontal. It applies to everything where AI applies. But then, of course, there is a carve out in the directive as well. So there is this directive, or the proposal includes a clause saying that it shall not affect rules of liability in the field of transportation. So thinking about how that will apply to AD vehicles is a question that I have, because ever since I started in Volvo Cars, I think it was in the beginning of the 2011 and 12, people were started to talking a lot about autonomous vehicles. And since then, we have seen a lot of discussions in the legislation or among the legislators. And I'm not sure whether or not we will end up with like a vertical or a field-specific liability for AD vehicles. I think that in the UK, they are at least discussing that. I don't know how that will relate to a general AI liability proposal, but we'll see in the future. And of course, there's a carve out in the AI liability directive also for product liability. And as a car, and as Erik also said, I think that it is more likely to fall under the general product liability rules than under the AI rules, but let's see. One interesting thing with the AI directive or liability directive, I think, is that it will cover all damages. As you know, in product liability, it doesn't cover all damages. And it says explicitly also that in the preface that they are talking about that damages will be subject to interpretation in national law. So that will also probably cause like a fragmentation in the EU, how that will apply. But what I'm thinking is, I mean, from a liability perspective, I have difficulties in seeing how that will apply to other types of damages. The only thing that I've been thinking about is, I don't know if you remember or if you have seen an Irish comedian from the 70s. His name is Dave Allen. There is a sketch where he talks to a car, and the car doesn't allow him to drive away, and then he gets out of the car and slams the door, and the car says, "Don't slam the door." And I was just thinking that, I mean, could liability include such a case where there is an AI permitting or non-permitting you to start or drive the car? Could that cause a damage in the end? I don't know, but that's one thing that I'm thinking about. And another thing I'm thinking about, which I think probably will end up in some other regulation, but how will producers and manufacturers and those that are offering these kind of systems to the market, will the naming, if the naming is misleading, will that cause a ground for claiming damages? You know how many discussions there has been or have been around autopilot, and if that can be used. I don't think that will be this kind of damage that we are talking about, but I don't know. I'm just thinking that is one thing that could be relevant as well. And I know that in the UK that there is a discussion of proposing, or in the draft that they have presented to the Parliament, that they say that self-driving cars or autopilot or something similar like that should be reserved to a certain type of products. So it might very well be that it could be that kind of thing. And here we get the AI Liability Directive refers to the proposed AI regulation with respect to the AI definition. And this, I think this is really interesting from a philosophical perspective, but from a purely legal perspective, as an in-house lawyer, I would, of course, prefer to have a crispy definition. Like, I want to understand what is included and what is not included. But at the same time, I totally understand that, I mean, we have problems in defining what is human intelligence. And if we then want to use the word in artificial intelligence, like claiming that this is something that should imitate humans in some way, then if we can't define the basics, then it's really hard to define the next thing. And from what I understand, there is now a definition or a discussion in EU to change or possibly change the draft or the proposed definition of AI systems. And in the current proposal, the current proposal is talking about software. And this is my personal view, that I think that the US National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have a broader definition. It's vague, but it's broader. And at the same time, I think it excludes what I would like not to be included in the AI definition, because that institute's definition is talking about systems or devices that performs functions that are normally associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning, learning, and self-improvement. and of course, if I as a lawyer read that, then I would just think, hey, how should I know what falls within or what is in or outside the scope of that? But at the same time, I really believe that that definition is better fitted for the purpose. For me, that definition excludes ordinary process automation. And in a car, not just because it's a system, it does not mean that every subsystem in the vehicle is affected by AI. And for me, it would be important that it's possible, at least to argue that process automation is not included in the AI definition. And when talking about that, there is also this definition of high-risk systems. And of course, autonomous drive and ADAS systems will in some sense be high-risk systems. But the difficulty here is, I think that, I mean, when you are talking about a system, you can talk about the vehicle system on the entire vehicle level. You can talk about the propulsion system. You can talk about an infotainment system. You can talk about the steering system. And even in the active safety system, not all of the subsystems in an active safety systems are actually using the AI to make decisions. And I don't want to go into the details there, because then if there's an engineer here, they will probably say, I don't understand it. But maybe the AI parts are more into the perception field of the subsystems. When it comes to the actuating systems, that subsystem relies on the output from the AI system. So the actuation system is probably more of a process automation. So that is probably one thing that is a bit tricky in this aspect as well. And then we have this thing of burden of proof, which the AI Liability Directive proposes. So for me, the question is it reasonable that failure to disclose or preserve evidence shall mean non-compliance with the relevant duty of care? And I mean, from an in-house lawyer perspective, I could say, of course, that's not reasonable. But at the same time, considering that the technology that we are talking about and that AI is very much a black box, I really think that this is a good way to handle it. It will require companies to do a lot of documentation. It will require companies to do a lot of record keeping. I'm not sure how that will be done, because we already have that kind of massive obligations under the GDPR, and we all know how difficult it is to do it. All the requirements to make up so much documentation it's costing a lot, and it will require a lot of resources. But since this AI Liability Directive is not covering only vehicles, it's covering everything that has with AI to do. So, I mean, it's probably a good way to do it, but I think it would also be good to think about what is a reasonable level of documentation, because it's not really feasible to create so much documentation that nobody ever accesses or reads or understands. And this duty of care is also one thing that, and you've probably all heard about that discussion. Duty of care is how to develop the system. And then you always get into the questions, and that's not a new question, how safe is safe enough? And I think that there is an interesting thing here from a software perspective, that a premium car today has about 100 million rows of code. So 100 millions. I think that if I remember correctly, fighter jet, a modern fighter jet has about 25-30 million rows of codes. So a premium car today is, from a software perspective, much more complex than a fighter jet. And from what I've heard, that it is expected that an AD vehicle will have around 300 million rows of codes. So that's much, much more. So what is then duty of care? We know statistically, I found some figures that for every 1,000 lines of codes, a coder makes about 70 mistakes. Not all of those mistakes or bugs reach the customers. So how many reach the customers, and how many of these bugs are vulnerability bugs? So statistically, in an AD vehicle with 300 million rows of codes, there would be 180,000 bugs. So not all of them would be related to AD, but if we see that a premium car today has 100 million rows of codes and an AD vehicle would have 300 million rows of codes, we can expect that around 200 million rows of codes would be related to the AD system, probably. Just a rough guess. But with that, around more than 100,000 bugs would be related to the AD system, of which a part of that is AI powered. So where do you draw that duty of care? And I know there are language in the AI regulation talking about how to take that into account, but it will be difficult since the standard that we apply for automated system are so much higher than we apply on human beings. So it's a difficult area. And then one other thing or the last thing that I was thinking about in the AI liability directive is the causal link. So the claimant has to demonstrate non-compliance with the duty of care for the producer or the party that offers the system. So that's a part that has to be demonstrated by the claimant. And as Erik said, then you have this reverse burden of proof that if the claimants ask for evidence of the producer and the producer does not provide that evidence, because the producer is the only one, or the party offering the system is the only one that can provide that information, then the burden of proof will be reversed, and it will be deemed to be non-compliance if the producer cannot provide that evidence. But then we get into the next step of this causal link, which is vague, and this is where we get into litigation rules, that it says that if it can be considered reasonably likely based on the circumstances in each case that it has caused something or caused the output. So as you can read, it's really hard to make a law that is more specified, but in this case, it actually means that this will be decided on a case-by-case basis. So I don't have a better proposal. I think that the proposal that has been made here is rather, it's reasonable, but at the same time, it's so difficult for an in-house lawyer to give an advice to his or her business related to this. So I think it's very, very much, we will wait and see what the proposals will end up with, and see what kind of legislation will be the final product.